In this video, we're going to look at 4 more tools in ArcGISPro. Firstly, we're going to look at using spatial joins to add attributes from polygons to points. Then we're going to use the buffer tool to create new polygon layers around existing point and polygon layers. And we'll use the union tool to combine existing layers into new ones. And finally, we'll use the intersect tool to run point and polygon selections and create new point layers thereof. Okay, so now I'd like to show you how you can use a spatial join to join up attribute information from a point layer with that of a polygon layer. So we're looking here still at London and the different properties, the point data of the properties, as well as the polygon layer of economic activity. So what we want to do, if we just open this attribute table, is for every local authority and the corresponding economic activity statuses of its population, so ranging for percentage of people part-time working, full-time working, and so on, we want for that to match up with every property depending on which local authority it falls within. So for these two attribute tables to essentially join up for every point. And the way to do that is to click on this layer, and then at the top, what will automatically happen is that this feature layer tab on the ribbon appears, and in that we can click data, and then on that we're going to click on spatial join, and it automatically fills in our properties layer as the target feature, and we want to join it up with that polygon layer, which is called economic activity. And you can give it a name, so maybe let's call it spatial join, example. And we're going to choose a one-to-one join so that for every property, it's going to get assigned the corresponding local authority. And we're going to choose to intersect. But if this were of interest, you can also choose a slightly more spatial condition to match them up by, but intersect is the most basic one. And if we press OK and run this, we create a new layer. And if we open up the attribute table for this new layer, we can see that it has the information of every one of these properties. Here, the latitude, longitude, the address information, the other attribute information on the type of properties, and then moving over on to the right, it has now also included the corresponding local authority column or field, and also every field or column of economic activity as is appropriate for that local authority. So next I'd like to demonstrate to you how we can use the buffer tool in our spatial analysis of finding the optimal property here in London. So what I'll just do for the time being is turn off the economic activity layer and actually also our properties layer. And in this project, I've added 2 other point data sets. One is of some train stations here in central London, and also points of every tube station in London. And what I want to do is use the buffer tool to find out what kind of areas fall within a certain distance of each of these points, so that later we can use this to figure out which properties are located close enough to a transportation hub. So there's 2 ways of doing this. One is by dissolving the outcome buffers into one feature, and the other one is by preserving for every input point a different feature. So I'll just show what the difference there is. In order to use the buffer tool, what you need to do is go onto the analysis tab of the top ribbon instead of the map. Go to analysis. You can already see it here, buffer. If we click that, it opens this new window. And for input feature, we want to click our train stations layer first. And you have to give it a name. So let's call this trains 500 buffer. And I'm saying 500 because I'd like to buffer 500 meters around every train station. And it allows me to select a unit here. So if you're not comfortable with meters, go for any of these other ones. And we're going to choose to not dissolve our output features just so you can see what that looks like. And if I run this, and I'll turn off the tube layer for the time being, you can see that it creates this new layer of buffers of 500 meters around every one of these train stations. And the reason what this not dissolve selection did is that each of these buffers is a separate feature within this layer. So if we look at the attribute table, you can see that for every train station, there's a different buffer. And the alternative to that is to dissolve all of these buffers into one feature, which can be handy. And I'll just demonstrate that for the tube stations. I'll leave this attribute table on display for the time being. So now let's buffer around the tube stations and maybe go for a 200-meter buffer. So again, we'll click our buffer tool, select our tube stations as the input layer, and call this tube 200 buffer, and 200 meters around every tube station. And we are going to select to dissolve them. So let's run that. What this basically does is that it overlaps the buffer for wherever the points overlap. Such as, for example, over here, these tube stations are so closely related that it just turns into one big buffer. So if I click this, you can see that every tube station, it's all in one feature. And that looks like this in the attribute table. Just one feature. So now that we've created both a layer of areas that fall within 200 meters of tube stations and also areas that fall within 500 meters of train stations, now might be a good time to introduce the union tool. So what this does is that it allows you to combine all input features and their attributes into one and the same output feature class or layer, essentially. So if we wanted to, say, create a layer that's basically transport buffers of areas that fall into either that buffer of the tube stations or that of a train stations, but have it in one layer, what we could do is at the top ribbon, go up again into the analysis tab, and then we can either press this arrow here and have this drop down all the different types of spatial analysis tools, and find it here in the overlay features. It's got the union tool there. And similarly, you could also just click on geoprocessing toolbox and search for it manually. So if I type in union here, it gives you that exact same display. So input features, we want to put in the tube buffer and also the train stations buffer. So if we drop this down and add both of those, all we have to do is give it a name. So maybe we'd like to call this areas near transport hubs. And then if we run that, it's going to create a layer that combines both of these buffers, which is going to be useful for the next thing. So here's our new layer, and we can turn off the tube and also the trains buffers and see that this layer now has both of them combined. And the attribute table of that looks like this. And that's it. So now that we've created this layer of areas that in blue are within an appropriate distance of transport hubs, we might like to display our properties layer again. And we can now use a tool called the Intersect tool, which is going to help us decide which properties are within the appropriate distance of a transport hub. So we find this again in the Analysis tab at the top. And if we click this arrow here and open this window again, it's not the union tool of the overlay feature tools, but it's the Intersect tool that we're going to use this time. So if we click that, we want as our first input feature the areas near transport hubs. So that's the polygon layer of all the blue buffers we created around the train and tube stations. and also our properties layer, which is the point layer on display now. And let's give it a name, maybe suitable locations. And we'll, as an output type, we'll create it into points because that's just clear. Run that. And we've now created this point layer here, suitable locations. If I just change these points to yellow, you can see that all of the properties that fall within those buffers have been put into a separate layer here.